Greetings from Washington, D.C., and welcome to this live webinar series on economic and financial developments facing Lebanon today. My name is Ronnie Hammad. I'm a member of the Life Advocate Committee, staff member of the World Bank, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. As the government of Lebanon resumes negotiations with the International Monetary Fund on a potential program to address the worst economic crisis in its history, my guest today will delve into the prospects for an agreement, the size of a potential program, and what reforms are going to be required to address it. LIFE is a worldwide membership organization of Lebanese professionals in finance, consulting, law, and tech. It is strictly non-political and non-religious. Last year, to address the crisis in Lebanon, LIFE created the Advocate Pillar, which aims to channel LIFE's collective expertise and resources to influence policymaking in Lebanon. According to the World Bank, Lebanon is set to experience one of the worst economic contractions of any country in the past 150 years. Since 2018, GDP is estimated to have shrunk from $55 billion to 20 in 2021, lower than it was a decade ago. Such contractions are typically associated with war, not deliberate policy. After 25 years of a fixed exchange rate of 1,500 liras to the dollar, it is now 20,000. People were getting 10 to 12% interest on US dollar deposits in their banks, and now they can no longer access their accounts, save for a few $100s. Inflation over the past 6 months has been 140%, among the highest in the world. For those on fixed income, inflation is like a tax on the poor. And poverty has jumped dramatically. According to the World Food Program, 1 in 2 households is struggling to access food, healthcare, and basic services. Families are having to make choices about who gets to eat, and 1 in 4 children are sleeping hungry in Lebanon today. On some days, electricity is only available for 2 hours a day. Many hospitals are prioritizing urgent surgeries only, with many unable to pay employee wages. Basic medication is in short supply, and many doctors, nurses, and professionals are fleeing the country. The minimum wage, which used to be the equivalent of $500, is now $37 a month. This has all kinds of implications, but most alarming is the impact on public sector employees, and particularly the army and police. And as we are saddened by what we are witnessing today in terms of the violence unfolding, we hope the authorities will be able to control it as soon as possible. So all this brings us to the role of the International Monetary Fund. The IMF assists countries hit by crises by providing them financial support to create some breathing room as they implement critical economic reforms to restore stability and growth. So a lot is riding on a potential IMF deal. LIFE welcomes the decision by the government to resume negotiations with the IMF. And to help us understand what a potential program is likely to entail is my guest today, Sami Geadah. Sami was until recently the alternate executive director at the IMF Board representing Lebanon. Sami, before that, was a staff member at the fund, where he headed program negotiations, macroeconomic surveillance, financial sector assessments, and technical assistance to central banks. Sami has a PhD in finance from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and a BA in economics from the American University of Beirut. Welcome, Sami, and thank you for taking time to talk to us today.
Good to see you, Ronnie. Good morning, good afternoon. And, thank you very much for this opportunity to you and to LIFE. And, I look forward to our discussion.
Yeah, great. For those of you out there, if you have a question, please use the chat function on Zoom, and we'll get to it in a few minutes after we have an initial kind of conversation with Sami. Sami, before we get into the details of an IMF program, I wondered if you could just take a few minutes to explain your role on the board of the IMF representing Lebanon. Who appointed you to this position, and what is your role vis-a-vis fund management?
Okay. As member of the board, as all board members, we really have two responsibilities. One is a general one, basically to ensure that the IMF delivers on its mandate. And this comes when we discuss, programs, developments with other countries, general policy issues. And the other aspect of the job is to look after the interests of our constituency, the countries that we represent. The office that I was in when I left, we represented 11 countries, 10 Arab countries, and the Maldives. And when I say look after their interests, it's presenting their positions at the board, defending the authorities' position, advising the authorities in negotiations or discussions with the government, but also when it comes to general policy issues. I'll give you some quick examples. I mean, over the past years, there's been a discussion within the IMF on the quota formula, which determines each country's contribution to the IMF and thereby its voting power. And I mean, you think it's an objective thing, you know, what variables go into the formula, but then what countries end up doing, they end up pushing for the variables that end up benefiting them. So it's these sorts of things. Now, who appointed me to the position? It was 12 years ago. There was a long serving executive director, Mr. Shakur Sha'lan, who was executive director for 26 years. And he asked me to be his alternate when I was at the staff. Unlike other offices, other executive director offices, I mean, they get appointed by their countries, and then the country gets to appoint the alternate, the senior advisor, everybody in the office. In our office, it was different. It's the only office at the IMF like that. The countries vote for the executive director, and then he gets to choose everybody. And I knew Mr. Sha'lan from when I was on the staff. He used to be my boss. And in fact, it was the third time he offered me the position. Finally, I said yes. And this is how I ended up there.
So it's in a way, it's not really typical that the executive director himself, Shakur Sha'lan, who is a legend at the fund and probably one of the longest serving executive directors, he actually got a chance to assign you rather than you being appointed by the government of Lebanon.
Correct. And this arrangement, I think, is only it's done by our office, by the office that represents these countries, the Middle East countries. I mean, the large countries, they have only one director, but ours had 13 countries at one point, and they vote on this one person. It was Mr. Sha'lan at the time, and then it was,
So the government is starting to negotiate with the IMF. My first question is, does the fund have an understanding of the real or actual assets and liabilities of the central bank, the gross and net reserve position, the size of the gold reserves? Have we done a forensic audit to really get a handle? Do we know, for example, how they've used the SDR allocation that was given to them? Can you give us an insight into what you feel the IMF understands about the situation in Lebanon?
I think the IMF staff, has a very good understanding of the situation. I think they have, a good understanding of the central bank balance sheet. It needs to be updated. It's been a while that, I think they've had numbers, but now, they've sent requests for data, they're looking after them. So it's obviously this needs to be updated because a lot has happened over the past 2 years. In terms of the audit, I don't think, unless I'm mistaken, that the IMF ever asked for a forensic audit of the central bank. I know this is a demand, in Lebanon by a lot of people. The IMF would be very interested, and I think they have asked for a financial audit, in order to pin down all the the numbers in the central bank balance sheet. But they have a pretty good idea of what the balance sheet look like, even though at this point they need to be more specific about the numbers.
Yeah. There's a lot of questions that in doing this, work, there's a lot of questions that were arisen about the negotiation team on the government side with the IMF. Many of them have been involved in the putting in place the exchange rate regime, what some people call the Ponzi scheme, that led to the financial collapse and the collapse of the economy. Some members are under investigation in at least 3 jurisdictions. And I just wondered, I know, IMF staff are highly capable, they're very savvy, they've negotiated with, governments around the world. But I'm just wondering, what's your thoughts about how the IMF team is thinking about working with the people who were part of the problem?
I mean, not typically, always, actually. I mean, when the IMF negotiates or have discussions, with the country, I mean, we're talking about policies. I mean, it's not an issue of certain people or personalities. And if you go back to saying, I mean, who is responsible for the financial crisis? I mean, the list is long, and maybe this is a topic for another discussion, but you should look at the pegged exchange rate, the high interest rates that followed, the decision to borrow in dollars, the big public sector borrowing requirement, the economic governance that we had, as which you see in the electricity sector, the regional developments with Syria and the Gulf. So but at the end, I mean, it's an issue of policies and not, and strictly that, So, I don't think, I mean, there's an issue there. And I would not, I would not jump to, blame the financial crisis on this person or that person. I mean, it's an issue of what policies led us to this situation and how do we get out of it. And I don't see any issue there, frankly. Yeah.
All right, let's get to the policies.
Okay.
So when we think about an IMF program, my sense is that there's a kind of a few buckets of areas that we need to deal with. One around, fiscal strategy on spending and revenue and debt. Another is around the financial sector and the balance sheet of the central bank and most banks. Probably figuring out a way to restore economic growth and stability, and stability in the first place, and then economic growth. Figuring out a way to deal with the exchange rate. Right now we have multiple exchange rates, and try to come to a unified exchange rate so that we have a competitive. And then obviously, some sectoral issues. You brought up the electricity. We can talk about that a little bit. So let's start. So these are the 4 buckets. Are there any other? I'm sure there are many others, but the primary ones are these. Is that just to kind of make sense?
No, I should have taken notes while you were giving these buckets to follow up on them.
All right, we can start up with the fiscal. I mean, we can start up with the fiscal bucket if you want.
Okay.
Right. So we have. I mean,
okay.
The fiscal is linked to obviously revenues and expenditures, and the debt. Right. I mean.
Okay. Yeah. You obviously need to deal with the fiscal. Okay. Yeah. And dealing with the fiscal is really 2 things. I mean, one is that you want to make sure that the fiscal position is sustainable, and sustainable in terms is that whatever borrowing they need, can be financed in a sustainable way. So we need to look at the structure of public finances, and also the composition and whether things are being spent the way they should be spent. Maybe you need to look at the civil service, and that's one potential area. Another area is obviously that has taken a lot of fiscal transfers is the electricity sector. I saw an estimate some time ago is that 40% of the debt, our debt, is as a result of the transfers that were made to the electricity company, ADL. So you need to have, a serious look, at the fiscal side. The other part of it, and this is really important, not just for the fiscal, is that you need to restructure the debt. Okay. And in order to restructure the debt, in order to have credibility with the creditors, with the bondholders, whether in Lebanon or outside Lebanon, okay, you need to have an economic program. And this is where the IMF can help I mean, anything that Lebanon needs to do on its own, whether or not there's an IMF program. I mean, we need to do those things. I mean, having an IMF program will give it credibility. But the other big bucket is, what do you do about the debt? How do you restructure it? And I mean, the authorities have hired legal and financial advisors. So I would expect that work would continue to proceed in this area. Now, once you have that, then you need to go and deal with the banking system. You know exactly what is the size of the losses, and then you need to worry about how do you distribute the losses in an equitable way. How do you recapitalize the banking system, and then you need to deal with the structural measures, electricity sector, I meant, but also more widely the issue of economic governance and transparency and all that, which is a big factor in what led us to where we are now.
Let's untangle one of these things at a time. So when I look at the latest debt data, total external debt is around $68 billion according to the World Bank, the latest figure that just came out, and around 31 billion is held by bondholders, and another 25 is held by commercial banks. 24.5. So the bulk of the debt is held by commercial banks, I take it external banks perhaps, and bondholders. So when we're thinking about bringing Lebanon to a sustainable debt level, and my understanding is that sustainability over the medium term looks at 70 to 80% of GDP or GNI. I mean, that's a substantial debt relief requirement that's going to be having to be taken by bondholders, as well as commercial banks. I mean, Lebanese debt today is trading at around 17 cents to the dollar. So you're saying that in order for us to do that, we have to have an IMF program.
I'm not saying we can have that without an IMF program. I mean, Lebanon can go ahead with these things without. I mean, having an IMF program will make it easier. It'll give more credibility, to whatever we're doing. But we need to do it with or without an IMF program. Now, in terms of how much the debt needs to be reduced, yeah, it's probably quite substantial. I mean, I don't know exactly what number we need to be at. I mean, one important ingredient that could be useful in the process is for the IMF staff to update its debt sustainability analysis. And here the methodology has changed within the IMF. I mean, it used to be much more rigid in terms of percent of GDP, interest service, all of that. It has become more sophisticated and I think much more useful. And I mean, if we start with that, then we have a pretty good idea of more or less where we should end up with the debt as a guide for the discussion with creditors. Yeah.
So what is the current measure on debt service to, say, exports? I mean, is there a measure of what?
No, the new methodology, which is still being rolled out, is, it used to be, traditional. I mean, they tell you, okay, if you're an emerging country, you should have a debt to GDP ratio of 70% of GDP. Okay, and the question was, okay, do you try to get the 70% at the beginning or eventually at the end? It's not that anymore. I mean, they look at maturities, look at service, look at the composite. I mean, who are the holders of the debt? So it's much more sophisticated. And so these hard numbers that we used to refer to, you look at them, but it's not as rigid as it was before. But so if you ask me, if you ask me for a particular number, what should be? I don't know. I mean, before the exercise is being done, then what you do is that you end up with fan charts at the end, looking at debt to the future, different scenarios where it could be, just to make sure that the thing will end up being sustainable. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was just asking, for example, if one of the biggest sources of revenue is going to be external foreign exchange, is going to be your export, and if current if $9 out of $10 of your export revenue is coming towards paying service charges or interest charges, I mean, I guess, is that ratio is that going to be taken into consideration in terms of?
No, of course. I mean, if you say, I mean, 9 out of 10, of course, this is not doable, not sustainable. And listen, and at the end, I mean, the objective is not to find a solution to, just pay the debt or come to a settlement of the debt. I mean, at the end, I mean, the objective is to get the country out of the mess that we are in. I mean, we need growth, we need sustainable growth. I mean, the debt is just part of many things, part of a big puzzle. And, at the end, you need to look at, I mean, the model that we had before, where we had large balance of payments deficits, large public deficits, we cannot have that. I mean, it relied on short-term capital inflows, came to the banks, we financed the government, we financed the BOP. I don't think we can go back to that model. I mean, we need to have a competitive exchange rate. We need to think of how you revive the export sector. I mean, whatever, whether it's agriculture, industry, tourism, the model that we had before, we cannot go back to. So we need to think of what is going to be the business model of Lebanon, and make sure that we do the structural reforms, the fiscal, whatever, that would underpin this new future that we hope to have.
Yeah. So, but none of that future makes any sense if you don't tackle the financial sector. And so that's, of course, a big interest to a lot of people. So can you share your thinking on how the bank restructuring is going to take place? I mean, obviously, having 90 plus banks is not a viable financial sector. How is the fund thinking about, assessing the bank, the viability of every bank, and how are they going to deal with the depositors?
And this is probably one of the most difficult questions that needs to be addressed. At the end, obviously, you need to have a solvent banking system, and you don't know what is the situation of the banks, of each bank, before you know exactly what's happening to public debt, given that the banks hold a lot of this debt. I'll give you a little digression, a little background. When the FSAP, Financial Sector Assessment Program, the World Bank and the IMF started in 1999, Lebanon was the first country to be assessed. It was part of the pilot program. Kazakhstan was the second. I did Kazakhstan, a friend did Lebanon. And, one of the things that came at that point, the big risk for the banks was the exposure to the government. This is more than 20 years ago. Now, the crisis has happened. The value of the debt has plummeted. I mean, you mentioned 17 cents to the dollar. And until we know exactly how we're going to restructure this debt, we will not be able to know what is the position, of the banks. Okay, and one of the things that at the end, typically, and I expect this will happen, is that you end up treating domestic and external creditors the same way. You cannot differentiate between the two. Okay, now, once you get to that point, you say, okay, how are we going to recapitalize the banks? Okay, the ideal way, the way that the IMF usually say is that, listen, you go to the bank shareholders. Okay, the first thing that the first item that's on the line is the equity. Okay, and I don't know how you go. I mean, the specifics are to be there. Maybe you get the shareholders to put in more money if they're willing. Maybe you merge banks. Maybe you get foreign participation. I mean, but at the end, you need to have a viable economy. You need to have credible policies in order to give trust for that people to want to invest in the banking system. And then the question about depositors. I mean, what the IMF would probably tell you, and what I would recommend, is that you try to protect the small depositors, the medium-sized depositors, and what is medium, what is large, is that you need to look at the distribution of deposits and numbers and the size of deposits, and that's how you end up differentiating between the two. But ideally, you protect the small and medium-sized depositors, and large depositors. One instrument which is usually done is that you convert the deposits to shares in the banks or equity, or things like that. So these are the sorts of things that we probably end up having to look into. But as a start, you need to have, you need to know, what's happening with the government debt, which is a big chunk of bank assets.
So there's a lot of things you just said, which I would like to just unpack a little bit. So the first part is your view that, so small depositors should be protected. Do you have a sense of what we mean by small depositors? $50,000, $100,000 equivalent. Do you have a sense of what the thresholds are?
No, I don't. And the way you end up at these thresholds is, you get, and this information is available, and you look at the distribution of deposits. Okay, so many have deposits up to, I don't know, $5,000, so many up to 10, 15, whatever on. And you look at the capital needs of the banks, and you say, okay, fine, this is so much is going to come. I mean, it's going to come from equity. You figure out this is how we need from deposits, and so in terms of a number, I cannot give you a number. You need to look at really the distribution. You need to see what are the potential sources. I mean, in an ideal situation, you don't touch any of the deposits. But given the size of the losses that we have, I don't think this is viable. I mean, maybe what you end up doing is that fine. If the large deposits, they end up frozen for a while. I mean, there are many ways of ending up, but what we have now, everybody being frozen is the sort of thing that would typically be advised against.
Yeah. So the other thing you said was that you would recommend, or one thought would be that for the larger depositors, or for all depositors who might not get their full money back, that they are translated into shares in the banks. But we know that not all banks are going to be viable, and we're going to see perhaps a lot of consolidation at some point when they started. So how do you kind of see that working?
As you probably said, some banks might have to close. There'll be probably mergers. For good banks, maybe the owners would be willing to put on more funds, get foreign participation. There'll be changes in the banking system. Exactly how this will unfold, I don't think anybody can really tell you.
But so the central bank, in the last few months, issued this circular 151 and 158. And in a sense, what both of these circulars indicate is really basically the lirification of dollar deposits. And so they're offering people to withdraw certain amounts of money from their own accounts at various exchange rates, and in effect, kind of reducing their liabilities by kind of dangling this idea that people are getting some of their money back, because obviously trust in the financial sector is kind of plummeted. Do you have any sense of how this kind of policy of lirification, do you have any sense of the magnitude of this? What's it costing depositors, or how much money, or how much of the liabilities is being reduced by the banks?
No, I would need to look at the numbers for that. But this is one thing also, it's not unusual for countries in financial crisis to do this sort of thing. It's been done in other countries before, but in terms of we need to look at the numbers. Unfortunately, I don't have them, in front of me. Yeah.
All right. So just kind of like conclude to just summarize. I'm just looking at the time because I want to get to some of the questions in the chat. So you're saying that there's going to be an assessment of individual banks, looking at their viability, which needs to be restructured. And then when you look at the depositors, you're looking at the different thresholds, looking at the needs of the banks to be recapitalized, and then potentially looking at some money coming from shareholders to help recapitalize the bank. So there's a number of sources of funding to figure that out. Some people estimate that figure to be around $30 billion. And I'm quoting off the top of my head, Nasser Saidi. And I wondered what you thought about that figure and whether that might be able to come from.
Right. I mean, it's possible. I really can't comment. I mean, I don't really have the information to be able to comment, on this figure. But the things that you mentioned about, the need to go through, individual banks and assess their viability. I mean, just to be clear, I mean, this is the sort of thing that the central bank, the Banking Control Commission, will end up doing, and not necessarily the IMF staff going through each bank. And so, and just to make it clear. Yeah.
And if there is a negotiated program at some point, we'll get to that in a minute. So this stuff, I take it will probably take some time. I mean, so it's not something that's going to happen overnight, obviously. So how long does this process take of kind of figuring out the viability of different banks and structuring? And is there the governance structure that the fund has any confidence in that they're able to do this in a kind of fair and equitable and transparent manner?
In terms of timing, I've seen programs being negotiated within weeks. And I've seen programs that have dragged on for months and months and half a year and more than that. So I think there's a will on both sides to come to an agreement. I mean, the start of the process is to update the information, to have a pretty firm idea of what 2021 will look like. And then they go from there. And in terms of governance, I mean, typically, what you end up, and this is in all IMF programs, is that as you know, but it is, you have a set of conditions, set of measures, agreement on policies, on sometimes very, very specific, that is agreed between the authorities, meaning the Minister of Finance, the government, and the central bank, about what is to be done and when it is to be done, and it's quite elaborate. And then basically the program progresses on the basis of these milestones. Yeah.
So I'm going to try to get to some of the questions coming up, but I wanted to just ask you a quick question about what is your thought on having a negotiation just as elections are looming in the horizon. There are potentially supposedly parliamentary elections in March, and so do you think an IMF program is going to be signed off by different political parties in the country? Is there going to be a socialization or public mobilization of support for this program? Who's going to do that? Is the IMF? Probably not. My experience is not particularly good at this. So how do you kind of create public support for an IMF program that's going to be really, really tough? And will the details of this program be public?
Okay. I think I got 3 questions. Let me see if I get to them one. All of them. Tell me if I miss anything.
All right.
Listen, is it possible to have a program before the elections? Yeah, it is possible. And typically, I don't know, it depends how fast negotiations, are proceeding. Typically, usually, when a change in government is expected, what the IMF does is that they get the endorsement of, basically the political parties, is that they will support the program, should there be a change in government or when there is a change in government. So I would not say the fact that we have elections will just means that there will not be a program before then. The other question is that the program will be unpopular and how to get support for it, and then it will be tough. Usually IMF programs are unpopular. I agree with that. Unfortunately, in the case of Lebanon, or fortunately, but maybe unfortunately, our situation is so bad that it's hard to think that an IMF program would be unpopular. I mean, IMF programs are designed to avoid the situation that we're in. I mean, things are so bad. So whatever is agreed, has to lead to an improvement. I mean, typically the tough things in an IMF program is what? Movement on the exchange rate. This has happened. Subsidies. This has happened. I mean, all of the things that you want to avoid have happened. So if you have an IMF program that gives some credibility to policies, it'll encourage donors and foreign support to come in. And the way you get support for it is that to show that it is for the good of the country. This is, as I said earlier, we need to do these things with or without an IMF program. And I would say, you need to be transparent about everything. And whether it's published, it will be published. The rules in the fund right now is that anytime you have a program, the report on that program is published, is put on the website. That didn't used to be the case, but that has been the case now, since some years ago. Please tell me if I missed anything.
No, I get the part. I'm just talking about. So you're saying that in the sense the situation in Lebanon is so bad that probably a lot of people are calling for an IMF program in a way. My sense is that people are looking to an IMF program. And I suspect that the IMF program in itself is not as important as the leveraging effect of other financing from World Bank, other multilateral, the European Union, and other bilateral donors who might provide some funding, particularly for, say, reconstruction and development. So the funding the fund provides, do you have a sense of the magnitude of that funding?
Not really. Typically funding is done as percent of quota. Lebanon's quota is about, $860 million. So maybe a reasonable estimate would be 3 to 5 times quota over a 3-year period. But, I think the amount of funding itself is not that important. It's the catalytic effect that it will have, that it will bring other support. A lot of donors, are waiting for an IMF program to give credibility to the policies, and they will proceed, on that basis. So I would not, it's not the amount of the funding that's important. It's as you know. But in terms of amount, this is what I would expect.
Where does the funding go? Is it sit in the central bank to provide support for the exchange rate and balance of payments stability, or how?
No, absolutely. Traditionally, it goes to the central bank. It's to build central bank reserves. What has been done recently, and more so with increasing number of countries, especially after the as a way of dealing with the COVID, is that some of these funds, or all of them in some cases, get on lent to the government to finance the budget. But this is not typically the case. But so to answer your question, yes, it goes to the central bank, but some of it could be used to finance the budget, depending on the program. This has been done in the region in the case of Jordan most recently. Yeah.
So I'm trying to get some of the questions in the chat, and there's quite a few, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to so many, but one of them asked a question on the IMF, on the SDR allocation that was just given to Lebanon. Do we know, well, first of all, was the fund, did it have any choice about giving the money to the fund, to Lebanon or not? And do we know how they used the money and what they could use it for?
Okay. As background to the SDR allocation, I mean, this was basically, it's an allocation to all the IMF members, okay? It's basically was done because there was a need for additional global liquidity, okay? And I mean, the proposal has been on the table for a while. I mean, as you know, the US has effectively veto power at the IMF. The Trump administration was against it. There was a change in the administration. The new administration, went for it. So this is it happened. Now, specifically the way it works, for Lebanon, as it is for all other countries, what the IMF does is that they put it in the account of the central bank. So it's an asset of the central bank. At the same time, it's a liability of the central bank to the IMF. And what they end up doing, they charge the central bank interest on this amount, but then they give back the interest since it's an asset of the central bank. So they thought the two things balance out. Now, the country has the option of using these reserves, of converting them from SDR to dollars or euros or yens or whatever. And Lebanon has done that, okay? So what happens now, and I'm sorry that I'm going into all these details, is that the IMF is charging Lebanon interest on this money, and Lebanon, wherever they place those funds, is earning interest on them somewhere else, okay? So the way it is typically treated is as part of central bank reserves, like any of the other central bank reserves. Now, whether Lebanon spends it, not spends it, I mean, you cannot treat it any differently than central bank reserves. It's not budget support. Countries can use it, especially during this crisis, COVID crisis, to I don't know, import vaccines or
what if they're using it for subsidies, for example, that, and most of the subsidies are going to, say, fuel and other things that are going to smuggling to other countries.
But you cannot, I mean, the way I think about it, I don't differentiate between that and the rest of the central bank reserves. I mean, it's the same. It's the same pot. I mean, theoretically, the central bank could have borrowed that money from somewhere else and use it. So it's not, I mean, when you say we use it for subsidies or whatever, ideally, this is a government decision. It's but from the central bank point of view, it's part of reserves. And okay, so the central bank got these extra reserves that they can use to import or to finance imports, but it should not be treated like any other part of reserves. At least this is how I think about it.
So I want to get to two issues. One is the issue of the exchange rate, and the other is kind of the real economy. So in order to kind of restart the economy, we're going to have private sector job-led growth. There is no growth if we don't have electricity. And in addition to the fact that electricity is being drained on the budget, anywhere from $1 to $1.5 billion or 3% of GDP almost, is going towards financing of this sector. So my question is, so what's the thinking? How does the IMF try to implement a structural reform around electricity? And I understand that Kristalina, for example, has prioritized climate change in IMF lending. Would it insist on a, say, renewable energy mix, or insist on on Lebanon's already made a commitment to move towards more renewable energy, solar, wind, or others, in the way it negotiates this program?
I doubt it. I'll tell you why. I mean, the IMF, are not experts on electricity. I mean, it's really the World Bank area. I mean, what they care about is the macro implications. And the macro implications is that the amount that the budget spends on that sector, the way the electricity sector is run it's a huge cost to the balance of payments.
Ultimately, it's a big governance issue.
It's a governance issue. It's a high cost to the consumer. I mean, from a competitiveness point of view. So, but in terms of the details, how do you go about reforming the sector, distribution, generation, non-renewable? This is really, really, I mean, the World Bank area. I mean, it'll be a huge plus to any IMF program. And I think, to address this issue, I mean, I mean, when you think about the electricity sector, it's almost unbelievable that, what is going on or what went on. But, at the end, it's the World Bank who will need to deal on addressing the issues in that sector. Yeah.
On the exchange rate, do you see a path forward in terms of coming to a single exchange rate? And do you support a currency board?
I think moving to a single exchange rate is very important. For many, many years, the idea of moving from the 1500 to the dollar, was very difficult, but now, everybody would tell you it's inevitable, it has happened. And I think the sooner we move to a single exchange rate, the better it is. And I would think, I can't talk on behalf of the staff of the government who will negotiate, government authorities who will negotiate a program, but I would think, that should be part of any agreement. A currency board would probably be good for Lebanon as a way to establish or reestablish credibility. But the factors you need for a currency board to work, a lot depends on the fiscal. The government will not be able to borrow from the central bank at all. The way the central bank can support banks, that will end up changing too. So if the government can do the things that are needed for a currency board, then maybe we don't need a currency board. But, because it is tough, it is very tough. But countries have successfully used it to establish credibility. And if you can do it, I would not rule it out. But at the same time, if we're willing to do the things that are needed for a currency board, if we do them, that would be great, even without a currency board. Yeah.
Obviously, one of the issues that we're dealing with is that, commercial banks have huge assets at the central bank, and a lot of the debt of this, between central bank and commercial banks is interchangeable, and so that's probably, not particularly feasible in the current. And so you'd have to have a complete change in the governance of the way the central bank is run and the way credit is issued and provided to central banks. To commercial banks.
No, Ronnie, it's not. It's not. It's beyond. It's not an issue of governance. It's really the central bank mandate will change. What it is allow. It really becomes very restrictive. For every lira or pound that you're going to put out in the economy, you need to have. It needs to be matched by foreign currency reserves, 1-to-1. So you end up with complete credibility. And typically, countries who have done this, and at the very beginning when they started this, interest rates could be quite high because people will say, well, listen, we don't think this thing's going to hold, and we need to be compensated, and therefore the higher interest rates. So there could be a transition period, on that, until credibility in the exchange rate and the peg, is established. And of course, I mean, one big decision is that at what rate do you peg? And because once you peg it, and if you have a currency board, I mean, you cannot, move the rate a year later or 3 years later. It's well, it was overvalued or undervalued or whatever. I mean, you need to stick to it. So, I mean, that's another consideration for the country is, should we go back to a fixed exchange rate or not? And interestingly, I mean, I remember, growing up in Beirut. I mean, when all the world was pegged, we were one of the few countries that had the floating exchange rate. And you go, on Hammad and you see all the exchange dealers and with all the rates. And now finally, I mean, the world has moved to flexible exchange rates, and we're pegged, we've been pegged for a while anyway.
Yeah. So, the Life, once, made a statement that says really it believes that no economic stabilization in Lebanon is likely without substantive and credible economic and financial reforms, and supports, and feels that it requires an IMF program. And also believes that these reforms should include clearly identifying financial and banking losses as a first step for financial restructuring and distributing those losses fairly, unifying the multiple exchange rates, engaging in substantial fiscal reforms, and implementing a credible electricity generation plan. More importantly, it really believes that a monitoring system, which includes heavy engagement of Lebanon's international support group and the World Bank, should be adopted to deal with Lebanon's perennial and rampant corruption problem. My question to you is, what do you think are the consequences, given the political environment and the dynamics happening, of no deal with the IMF?
I think
there is the political space and the political will for a negotiation and an agreement.
Yeah. I think Lebanon needs to move on these kinds of policies, with or without the IMF. Okay, I think the point is whether we're able to take these policies, or not. The IMF will make it easier because it will provide financing and credibility, which will encourage other financing. So if we don't have, so it's in the interest of Lebanon really to have this arrangement. But if we don't, and if we're unable to take these policies, I don't see how we can get from the dire situation that we are in. It'll be more of the same. Sorry.
But all the, I mean, I'm looking at all these chat questions, and everybody is, and I'm sensing the same frustration, I guess, is that I get that they should be doing this, but there is clear sense that, there's a strong view that some of the policies that have been implemented are deliberate, I mean, there's no other way to explain how you can have such a massive contraction over the last few years. And the policymakers and the people who are in government today are the ones who are still making the decisions and now are negotiating with the fund. And why do we have expectations that they're going to do the right thing? And this is, I guess, what, if I could summarize in a few words, what everybody on this chat is asking is, what credibility do we have? What credibility does the government have in really, even if they said all the right things in terms of policies?
I really understand these concerns. I really do. And, let me put it this way. I mean, we're not, at least I'm not in a position to judge or to say why we believe this government has more credibility than other governments. I would say, listen, I mean, let's wait and see what happens. I mean, I really understand skepticism and the concern. And I would say, just let's see how things develop. I mean, I know, and what we have is that, if you look what has happened over the past years, the situation gets worse, and say, oh, it can't get any worse. It gets even worse, and then it's even worse and worse and worse. I'd say, let's wait. Give this government a chance, and let's see what happens. I mean, I'm not in a position to tell you why. You should feel one way or the other. Just let's wait and see.
Yeah. So if an agreement is reached in the next few weeks, I know we have a minute left. If an agreement is reached in the next few weeks and it happens before the elections, I mean, and elections are happening in March, who's going to be implementing these programs? I mean, will the new government feel responsible or feel accountable for feeling that they have to continue what this government negotiated? How do we think about this?
Sorry, your question is that who will implement it after the elections or in the run-up to the elections?
If there's a deal, an agreement is reached now, but if there's elections happening in March and there's potentially a new parliament and potentially a new government.
Well, listen, I mean, any agreement will be an agreement on a set of measures. There'll be a list of policy measures, and if they don't get implemented, the agreement will fall apart, and they will say, "Well, the program's off track." I mean, as long as there has to be in any agreement, some level of assurance that whatever is agreed is going to be implemented. And I would think, things like, a capital control law, progress on the debt restructuring, fiscal measures, probably in the budget for next year. I mean, and whoever is in charge will have the responsibility to implement these things. And if they don't get implemented, then the agreement is suspended. I mean, it works with any other country.
Yeah. I'm afraid the time has gone by so quickly. There's a lot to discuss, and I really want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule. And there's a lot happening in Lebanon, and we're really monitoring the situation very carefully. But I thank you for your thoughtfulness and reflections. And I know you are not an official spokesman for the fund at the moment, and nor for the government. And I really appreciate you helping us kind of navigate through this whole space. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for this opportunity. Actually, it was fun. Thank you.
Well,
okay, hope to see you later. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you all for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't able to get to all of them, but hopefully we will address them in future series of talks by the Life Advocate Committee, and we look forward to your participation in the future. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you. Okay, see you later. Bye.